ORDA Science Webinar 101 series on September 9, 2022 at 18:02 Universal Time. Recorded and organized by Samantha Foster and Microsoft Teams. Emily speaking.
Awesome. Thank you. So, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining our ORDA Science webinar. Usually, Jo Hink from USGS is here, but she's not in today, so I am taking over her hosting duties. So, big shoes to fill there. On the screen, you should be seeing a slide that shows our upcoming ORDA Science webinars. First up, later in October, we're going to be having our virtual national workshop, and we're pretty excited about that. So, there is lots of fun sessions there during the week, and one of them is on expanding your science toolbox. So we'll have some good.
Other topics in October include Introduction to Sonar Technology by Aaron Delaney, Living Pillings, Examples for Restoration by Samantha Richmond, How to Access and Use Free Commercial Imagery for Your NerdArt Case by James Hack, Animal Testing Alternatives, What is the Future of Toxicity Testing by Patricia Bright, Jessica Leet, and Barnett Ratner.
Presenters there. And then in November, there's going to be a webinar on prescribed burning and wildfires for restoration. So look for that. Hopefully you got an invite to both of those, to the workshop itself, and then also to the webinar in November. If you have any ideas for other webinars you might want to see, feel free to send us an email. You can put it in the chat box right now, or email myself or Sam or Joe, and we'll look to see if we can find some presenters on other topics.
Emails include samantha_foster@ios.do.gov or jhink@usgs.gov. The presentation will be available at www.usgs.gov/cerc/natural-resources-damage-assessment-and-restoration-NRDAR.
And then later, the slidings and the recordings will be made available on the website for you to take a look at later. I'll change my slide if I can.
ORDA co-producing science with diverse stakeholders from tribes to agencies across the American Southwest by Molly McCormick, U.S. Geological Survey, USGS Science for a Changing World logo. The findings and conclusions in the webinar are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of DOI's NerdArt program, the department including the trustee bureaus, or the United States, although some of the presenters may be employees of government agencies. The ideas described herein do not reflect the policies of those agencies, and no official endorsement should be inferred on NerdArt.
There we go. So today we have a presenter, Molly McCormick. She's from the U.S. Geological Survey, and her presentation is on co-producing science with diverse stakeholders from tribes to agencies across the American Southwest. So I have a very short little bio here. Molly is an ecologist and the coordinator of the USGS Restoration Assessment and Monitoring Program for the Southwest, RAMPS, where she collaborates with multiple stakeholders to develop creative solutions to complex socio-ecological issues across the southwestern U.S. And I think this has been on the schedule for a while, and I've really been looking forward to this presentation. So I'm excited for the next hour for sure. And so Molly, usually Joe asks for a fun fact, but she told me she did not get a chance to get a fun fact from you. So feel free to intersperse one if you'd like in your presentation. But with that, I'll turn it over to you and to get started. Thanks.
Molly is a woman with shoulder-length dark curly hair wearing a dark shirt and glasses. Her background is of an insect flying next to a flower with a USGS logo.
Okay, thank you so much for that great introduction, Emily, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As Emily mentioned, I am going to talk about how we co-produce science with diverse stakeholders from tribes to agencies across the American Southwest. Joe had asked me to give this presentation because even though most of you are not in the Southwest, she thought that some of these approaches might be relevant to your work. So I hope that that's true.
Co-producing science with diverse stakeholders from tribes to agencies across the American Southwest. Examples from the USGS Restoration Assessment and Monitoring Program for the Southwest, RAMPS, U.S. Department of the Interior, U.S. Geological Survey.
I work with Seth Munson and John Bradford at the Southwest Biological Science Center. But if I was to list all the names of the people who contributed to the projects I'm going to speak today, I would need maybe another slide or two. So I just want to acknowledge everyone. So RAMPS is the Restoration Assessment and Monitoring Program for the Southwest, which is a very long-winded way of saying we are connecting science to land management to enhance Southwest ecosystems. This is our geography across, iconic desert landscapes that really mean a lot to the American psyche and are known globally.
A topographical map highlights all of Arizona, the southern tip of California, the southeast corner of Utah, the western border and a little of the southern border of Colorado, half of New Mexico on the southwest corner, and the western tip of Texas.
So I just want to start by talking about why we exist. And even though we're going to be talking about approaches for stakeholder engagement, I think that starting with the why is so important because that allows you to show up with intention. And once stakeholders see that you really are wanting to solve problems, and you're committed, then I feel like the relationships get built a little quicker, better, more efficiently, and meaningfully. So I'll start with why we exist. As I said, we're working in these iconic American landscapes that, you can see in these photos, we're getting fires carried by invasive grasses in places that aren't fire adapted, and we're losing saguaro cactus, for example. Of course, federal land managers are mandated to conserve ecosystems for the American people. And we have all kinds of land use pressures from drought, dust, fire, land use, energy development. There's an oil and gas pad here in this photo, a dust storm on the Navajo Nation on the top photo. And unhealthy lands threaten livelihoods and ecosystems. And this is a photo of a dust storm in Phoenix. I don't know if many of you know that Phoenix multiple times a year we'll get these dust storms. It's a combination of an interesting meteorological phenomenon, but also degraded lands that used to be cotton farms but are now left open and bare. One of the early studies we did in our program, led by Stella Copeland, looked at a number of restoration projects across Utah. There's a really great database up there for a lot of their restoration projects, and you can ask interesting questions from these sort of state curated data. And what she found was that from 1950 to 2010, the size of these treatments was increasing. And also, and maybe more importantly, the sort of inflation adjusted cost of most of these treatments is also increasing. So these actions are getting larger and more expensive. And restoring in the desert is really difficult. So we're water limited. And oftentimes we'll do a project like this roadside project you see in the photo, and it'll be 2 years and we won't get any results, but maybe some invasive species. This is really common across our geography because we're trying to match seeding with precipitation windows, and they often don't meet. So what do we do about these issues?
Photos display grasses next to a road surrounded by reddish stratified formations.
Additionally, project outcomes are often not tracked. So this is a picture of an oil and gas reclamation site where they drill seeded. You can see the rows where the seeds were drilled, but not all of it took. And so do we ask, is this a finished reclamation site? Do we need more work? What would that even look like? These are all the kinds of questions that we're grappling with.
Splotches of green flora on dry ground.
And inevitably, any kinds of issues around restoration are, these are social ecological problems. So restoration is a human endeavor based on human desires. And these problems are very complex and intractable. This is a photo in the Mojave Desert showing how diversion of water in the Mojave River Basin created sandy soils to move, so much so that farmers lost their ability to irrigate based off of these duning soils before groundwater levels were depleted, which also happened here. And so millions of dollars are spent every year trying to restore these areas and push sand off of roadways. And this issue was created by this sort of complex interactions between creating water supply and damming and farming and just the ecological properties of these areas. And so thinking about moving away from sort of these issues towards solutions, we feel that communication and relationships among all levels of society and nature are required to sort of address this. And this is a photo of us co-producing science with a number of Park Service managers.
People sitting around a row of tables in a conference room with a projector.
And additionally, what's really important and sort of where I spend a lot of my time is weaving together multiple types of knowledge to develop projects with lasting effects. And so, yes, we use Western science, we're USGS, we bring to the table incredible cutting edge science. And also, what helps us to inform some of these projects are people who have spent their lives and even generations on the lands where we work and have incredible, vast knowledges of how these systems work and what the issues are. And so we don't discredit local knowledge and traditional knowledge when we're doing projects with folks. And so now I want to shift and give you some sort of tangible examples of how we're co-producing science with folks. And this and sort of our products can look anything from like a scientific map to facilitated workshops with people to on the ground, knowledge exchange and learning workshops. So just to sort of give you a framework for how we approach this work.
A plant with a root system is displayed.
We start with the root, which is really the partner and collaborator engagement. This is what drives all of our work. We don't start a project until we meet the partners and get their feedback. And then the backbone or the stem of our work is the research in most cases. Sometimes it's workshops and educational opportunities. And then finally, that fruiting body or the leaf is the decision support and communication. And that's sort of the outcome or product. And then that, of course, just like a plant, the leaf comes off the stem, goes back into the soil to sort of fertilize that partnership and collaborator engagement. So it's this cycle that happens. And these are some of the groups that we work with from, being USGS, of course, Department of Interior agencies, but we also work with the USDA, state agencies, tribal agencies, other non-federal and private partners, including ranchers, academic institutions, and tribes.
Logos included are the National System of Public Lands Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Reclamation, Northern Arizona University, Department of Fire Management, Forest Service, Department of Agriculture, DOI, Office of Wildland Fire, Navajo Fish and Wildlife, Plant Conservation Alliance, University of California, Riverside, Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, Canyonlands Research Center, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, University of Arizona, Colorado Plateau Native Plant Program, Friends of Verde River Greenway, Diné Native Plants Program, Tulani Lake Enterprises, Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, New Mexico State University, the Nature Conservancy Institute for Applied Ecology, Diablo Trust, Borderlands Restoration Network, Arizona Babbitt Ranches, McDowell Sonoran Conservancy, and Colorado University Boulder.
So I'll start with this example, and this was a climate adaptation planning for the National Park Service. So, the root of the partner and collaborator engagement is we had one park resource manager reach out to us and say, our park in Utah is already feeling the impacts of climate change and global warming. And we really need to think about climate adaptation planning with everything we do. But how do we do that? This is new for the park. We may have to take actions that we have never taken before. And how do we navigate that with some sort of, based on some sort of science? So this was sort of the landscape that we were working in when we started this process. And we ended up doing a number of workshops over a 5-year period. Here's some photos of us doing these workshops both before and during COVID.
People around a row of tables, standing and writing on walls, and remote meetings.
And the science that we did was very iterative. We had a couple products. One was a report of climate change impacts for this geography of parks on the Colorado Plateau. And the other one was an adaptation menu with concrete actions that people could take with every project that they were doing. And from the beginning, we would, our first step for that report was to develop sort of vegetation maps for each of these parks. And so the picture in the lower left is showing us presenting drafts of these vegetation maps and having folks in the room saying, actually, that's not quite right. And this is how we can make it better. And so I think that iterative process of getting continual feedback as we did the research was really important for creating a product that was accurate and useful. And so we created that report, and then we also are just about to finish this sort of management menu. And I wanted to show this, not to show you all the details of what's on it, but just to say the sort of one of the fruits for this project was this printable menu that people can use. They can put it on their wall, and then when they're going through project planning, they can look at this and make their projects more climate smart.
Colorado Plateau Grassland Climate Adaptation Management Menu includes 6 columns with headings including sustained ecological function, reduce stressors and disturbances, protect and restore, promote resilient plant species and genotypes, realign severely disrupted ecosystems, and promote adaptable organizations.
So, for example, a manager might be wanting to improve vegetation in a project area. Say maybe there's dust storms happening and reducing the visitor use experience. And so if they looked at our vulnerability report, they might see that sort of the cool season grasses are dwindling, with the exception of maybe rice grass, and warm season grasses are expected to expand with the exception of maybe blue grama. And so if they were going to seed this area to reduce the bare ground and the dust, then, before climate adaptation planning, they probably had a standard seed mix that they would use, and they would put it out whenever they had money, or maybe in the fall, which is sort of a standard practice in this geography. But after this climate adaptation process and looking at this menu, they might say, well, let's look at the standard seed mix we're using. Maybe we want to add more rice grass and less other cool season species. Maybe we want to add a lot more warm season grasses and maybe not blue grama. And then they also may look at there's a bunch of strategies they can use to increase their success of the seeding practice, including seeding multiple times over a number of years to try to catch that weather window favorable for germination and persistence. So this is how you go from status quo management to something that's a little bit more climate adapted by just making 2 or 3 small changes, nothing drastic. And I think that part is really important, because when we started this process, we all had maybe a handful of ideas of what we could do to be more climate smart. And at the end, this menu gave us a couple dozen options that are organized, that are more nuanced and organized across the spectrum of status quo to more unconventional actions. And I think that previously, what I heard a lot from people was, we're going to be more climate smart, and they jumped to this thing called assisted migration, which is bringing in new species from other places. And while that might be needed in some cases, there is a whole suite of actions now that they can choose, and more support for including science and science-based decisions in these processes. And there's a ton of these. We use the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Science process to create this, and there's a ton of these menus out there. And there's one for, they're making one for grasslands in the Midwest. There's one for tribes, one for recreation, a couple of them for forests. I think there's a total of 6 or 8 menus now. So these resources are available to you all today. And I'm happy to provide a link later in the chat to some of this if you're interested. So that was climate adaptation planning. The next I want to talk about is RestoreNet, which is our integrated field trial network for restoration. And so this project works with land managers and researchers on a common issue of revegetation bottlenecks. As I said, it's really difficult to have success seeding where we are. And so this is a map of all of the sites. We have some 25 or so now, including over 50 partners. And RestoreNet sort of has 3 overarching benefits. One, it co-produces science and engages land managers from the beginning of the projects to develop restoration treatments that people can use. Second, these sites serve as demonstration sites for knowledge sharing on restoration methods and showing a clear proof of concept. And then finally, it uses small restoration plots to test multiple treatments and determine best practices in a low-risk environment instead of doing it across a whole project area. And this way, effective treatments can be identified and then applied to larger projects later on.
RestoreNet sites as of January 2022 include Arizona and New Mexico mountains, Arizona and New Mexico Plateau, Chevron deserts, Colorado Plateaus, Madrian Archipelago, Mojave Basin and Ranch, southwestern tablelands, and the Sonoran Basin and Ranch.
And we're testing really simple things that people have done in this geography, well, since time immemorial. These pits are actually traditional ecological knowledge. And you know, when I was a restoration practitioner, I would do some of these things, but maybe not in a scientifically robust way. And then I may not have the resources to go back and look and see what actually happened. And then sometimes when I did learn something, I didn't necessarily tell my colleagues. So we're doing what people have done forever, but we're adding this layer of scientific robustness and also distributing the results across the whole geography, and then understanding how these treatment effects can change depending on what type of desert you're in.
Treatments include seed above ground con mods, surface mulch, and below ground pits.
And one of the really key pieces of this is the partner and collaborator engagement. So each one of those 25 sites has a land manager who is excited about it, is fully engaged, will often help monitor, in some cases take the site on almost completely, help us develop treatments to test. And so this is just some photos of us doing some of this collaboration. And the bottom photo is a photo during the COVID times where we did a workshop that was led by the ranchers that were collaborators on the project. And some more photos of this engagement. We have the project is split into domains, and so we have early career researchers at academic institutions sort of managing each one of the domains. And so then this creates this platform for so many students to add additional questions and to take on pieces of this. Most of the PIs are women, which is sort of interesting, not something we intended, but it's just a cool outcome. And we really think about engaging sort of underserved and underrepresented folks. We have, I think, 4 of the locations on tribal reservations. And then again, this picture in the upper left, we occasionally go back to our stakeholder group and show them what we're learning and then ask them for feedback.
People standing around flat, dry, grassy land, people posing indoors, and a group siting at a row of tables.
We have a protocol that we developed that anyone can take and install one of these sites. And actually, you know, another sort of side benefit of this project is that it allows me to start relationships with new people. So oftentimes people will hear that we have this RestoreNet and they're interested in maybe installing one on their site. And so I'll say, okay, great. Can we get together and go on a tour and talk about your issues and where you might put this site, and whether or not we end up installing one of these experiments on their land or the land that they manage, we've sort of catalyzed this relationship where we can look deeper into their questions and provide better support for them. And this process has happened so many times. I just wanted to note that having this experiment has created so many relationships beyond just RestoreNet. And then, for that fruit, of the RAMP's 3-step process, we have these report cards that we give our partners every year that talk about exactly what's happening at their site, if we did anything new, what we're finding, goes through some of the nuances, because we are developing guidance in general for the Southwest, but each site is different. And so folks have really enjoyed getting these annual report cards from us. Okay, and then the third project I want to talk to you about is some of our tribal collaboration. And really the foundation of this is weaving traditional knowledge in Western science. And it's an ongoing collaboration with the Navajo Fish and Wildlife and program, which is sort of the umbrella of the Navajo Natural Heritage Program and the Diné Native Plants Program. And we also collaborate with this tribal-led nonprofit called Talani Lake Enterprises, and their role has been so key because they end up being sort of the fiscal sponsor for a lot of our work together, because it can be difficult for the USGS to take money in with federal contracting delays, and it can be difficult for the Navajo Fish and Wildlife to take money because they've just been so incredibly overwhelmed with the strange impacts of COVID on their operations. And so having this tribal nonprofit has been key in getting a lot of work done. But we started just by having relationships with some of these folks over the years. And one of the first things we did was realize that the tribal community members, which include both employees of this tribal agency, but also ranchers and other key community members, influencers, if you will, didn't have the capacity that they wanted to do some of this revegetation work. So one of the first things we did was develop this sort of series of workshops where we kind of started at the bottom with some sort of Restoration 101. We introduced some of the common tools like the soil survey tools and some online herbariums tools that we use when we're planning restoration projects, and just sort of went over them. And then we went on a series of tours looking at sites that attendees in the workshop have led. So in the upper left, we have this cool project that happened at Hopi, where they installed some simple rock structures to reduce erosion. And then in the right, I realized that Miles, who's shown here in the plaid shirt, he worked for the Department of Ag, Navajo Nation, and he had developed this really neat app for tracking this wild horses, which is a really big problem on the Navajo Nation. These horses degrade the land in incredible ways. And so he had developed this app to track them. And so we wanted to sort of elevate his work and have him present to the group so that we could all become engaged and help him track these horses. So this is sort of the framework of what we did on this knowledge sharing grant that was supported by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Resilience Program. And then we shifted. After all of that, they said, that was so great, and now we want to actually just restore something. And so we did this project in Segi Canyon on the Navajo Nation, where we brought together multiple generations. And so we always have elders and youth. and everyone in between at these sites. So the project on the left, we're seeding some restoration species to be used. And on the right, we're installing a brush weir to reduce erosion in this Segi Canyon. And this is just more pictures of the same, where we are on the left, Jesse, Mike, and Nora Talkington from the Diné Native Plant Program are teaching folks about the native grasses. A lot of them wanted to know the names or how to identify these grasses, and so we had some extra plants left over from a project, and everyone got to take home one or two each of the species to develop these little showcase gardens to sort of increase this information about native grass. And then in the right, more pictures from this multi-generational project at Segi Canyon. And we do have one RestoreNet site on the Navajo Nation that was sort of an outcome of this work, but really sort of the fruits of this are about sharing knowledge and USGS providing technical support. The folks that I work with at the Navajo Fish and Wildlife are incredibly capable and smart and able to do all of this on their own, except that they're also incredibly overwhelmed. And they're trying to stand up this new program of the Diné Native Plant Program. And so really our role here is to provide technical assistance and do any task that they just don't have time to do. And that's sort of the nature of our relationship. And this picture, the larger picture here, one of the leaders of the group, this is our closing circle for this project in Segi Canyon, and one of the leaders of the group had tears in her eyes because she was remembering 10 years ago when she and I first met. She was leading a workshop, sort of a tour to Southern Arizona, showing folks about the magic of these simple rock erosion control structures, with the hopes that they could get the training they needed to implement this on the Navajo Nation. And here we were 10 years later at her first project, where we actually were installing these erosion control structures, which is the other photo, and training people how to do it. And it was really touching to see this sort of come to fruition. And that's really kind of how these projects work with tribes, as I've seen it, is I kind of use this analogy of building the relationship. It's kind of like growing a tree. You plant the seeds and you care for the relationship, and then eventually with time it might produce a fruit. But it does take care and patience and consistently showing up.
Erosion control structure with an arc of rows of stones.
And I think this is the last project I'm going to talk about. It's another project that was sort of a spin-off from our other work with the Navajo Fish and Wildlife. And this one is a dust risk project. And so folks from Fish and Wildlife came to us and said, our land use planning department could maybe use a little help. We have a horrible dust problem on the Navajo Nation, and we think that we would benefit from knowing where the dust risk is higher. And so we produced this map, which, at this resolution doesn't seem like much, but we do zoom in. When you zoom into these, this is a map of the different chapters of the Navajo Nation. When you zoom into them, it's really informative around where this dust is being mobilized and other places where not so much. So we produced these maps and are collaborating with a grad student at U of A who's using these maps to go out into our community and talk to folks about their perceptions of dust risk, the impacts of dust in their lives, with a focus on agriculture. And so this is Markel Begay, who is sort of leading this project. And I just want to read this quote about what this project is for her. And she says, "This is an important project because dust storms are a huge problem on the Navajo Nation that no one seems to be recognizing until now. With the strong winds and dust storms this year, people are losing roofs on their houses and there aren't resources to help. It is important that as a researcher, I go out and talk to the local people and capture their local knowledge and experiences. My hope for this project right now is to elevate the voices of the Navajo community members, especially the farmers and ranchers. They are on the front lines of climate change and experiencing the worst right now. I want to understand the issues and how this connects with land, food, water, health, and environmental justice for the benefit of the Navajo people and future generations. So this project is just beginning. Markel is out there right now actually with these maps, visiting the various chapter houses and chatting with her community members. So in conclusion, I'll just reiterate that the ranch approach to science includes partner engagement, research, knowledge sharing, and decision support. And this is done to match cutting edge science with some of the most pressing land management problems. This is a photo of us. Actually, last week, we did a field tour of some vegetation management that happens out on the Colorado Plateau.
Molly McCormick contact is mmccormick@usgs.gov, www.usgs.gov/SBSC/ramps. Twitter handle is at USGS_AZ.
And so that's my concluding slide. We have a website where you can sort of peruse the various products that we create for our partners. We make a lot of one-pagers on the science that we create so that folks can access that science in like 5 minutes in like an easy-to-use photo, you know. So that's all at usgs.gov/SBSC/ramps. This is a photo of a project we're doing on the US-Mexico border where we're collaborating with Customs and Border Patrol and a wildlife refuge and the Department of Wildland and Fire to sort of map needs and values at risk with fire. And so you can imagine with all of those perspectives, it's a very complex project. But it all starts with getting out in the field and looking at maps and talking about it. So that's the end. I think there's probably plenty of time for questions, and I'm happy to chat more with you. Thanks.
Emily speaking.
Thanks, Molly. That was great. Any questions or comments from the group? Feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask a question or a comment if you have any. I don't see any hands or anyone coming off mute yet, but Molly, I just, you definitely speaking my language when you mentioned the one-pagers and just all the different visuals that you have here. I was just curious, do you have like a dedicated staff to get all that sort of outreach and figure out what's the best ways to talk to people? Or I'm just curious because this is a big interest of mine.
Yeah, totally. Well, mostly our staff is me plus, you know, a couple interns, and then we have a field manager and the sort of managing our on the ground projects, and then usually a postdoc. But it would be cool to have a whole like data viz lab. That's like a dream. And USGS and water, missionary, and others are sort of kind of making that happen. If you're a data viz nerd, I recommend checking out what USGS Water Missionary is doing these days.
Yeah, Joe arranged a webinar earlier this year, I think, with the folks there. That was fantastic. Cool. So I see John has his hand up. So John, did you have a comment?
Well, yes, question and a comment. Let me get my hand down. Really interesting, Molly. Thanks for that information. I it come across your name, and we intersected a little bit as it relates to some of the work done in, I think, New Mexico and the BLM project. But it's really interesting to hear more about your work on the restoration front. So on that level, it's really interesting just to kind of see how well connected you are, and also that you're working with tribes. Related to this next month for the virtual workshop, kind of related to this, but in a participatory or citizen science sort of project. Sarah Souther from Northern Arizona University and Forest Service partner of Sarah's are going to be presenting on the Tribal Nations Botanical Research Collaborative, which is a partnership with Forest Service you've probably heard about. So I'm really interested in your work from that perspective too. But I'm curious, have you been working over the past years with, you mentioned a lot of agencies and tribes and federal partners, state partners. What about private landowners? Whether, you mentioned the former cotton farms that are now just kind of wastelands and producing dust and probably other issues. But as far as attempting to convert former ranch lands or other ag lands to productive areas, or at least native plant restoration. So have you had any partnership with private landowners, and what have your engagements been like with them?
Molly speaking.
Yeah, a lot to say there. The lands around Phoenix are kind of a tricky one, but so I'll kind of skip that one and say that we do work a lot with ranchers who work on across their own private, state trust, and federal lands. And we've had great experiences collaborating with ranchers across the Southwest. And then as far as sort of farmers, I encourage you all to check out the National Seed Strategy, which is kind of a great way to engage farmers. There's sort of an opportunity out there right now for people to farm native seed as a crop and reduce their water use and increase the sort of climate change resilience on their lands, especially farmers who are facing reductions of irrigation supply. So that's an opportunity that could be realized in so many places. So hopefully that answers your question, gives you some examples of how we work. And if you have any more detailed questions about how we're engaging specifically with ranchers, I'd be happy to answer them. I mean, mostly, and I just co-wrote an article about this in Restoration Ecology, but stakeholder engagement can really begin with showing up where people are. So, I go to have coffee at the local coffee shop, or if the ranchers are having, Joe, I think your camera's on. I don't know if you know that. I'm glad you could join us. So there's a few rancher collectives throughout the Southwest that gather occasionally. And so I show up at their meetings, and that's like a really great way to engage diverse partners, is to figure out when they're having their meetings and showing up instead of asking them to show up for you.
Emily speaking.
Right. Are there any other comments or questions? And just in the chat, I don't know if you can see it, there's a comment, just great work, amazing work. Thank you for the presentation, and some thumbs up there for you, Molly.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Molly, this is Joe. I do have a question. I hit the camera instead of my mic button. You had I joined a little bit late, but you had mentioned some resources, those 6 to 8 that had to do with climate resiliency. Can you drop that link in the chat or send it to me and I can get it distributed to people? I think that I'm not aware of those, so I think that would be really interesting to take a look at.
Sure.
All right, great. Looks like it's in the chat now for folks. Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, I will let everyone go.
John speaking.
I
Go
have
ahead,
one
John.
more real quick.
Yep,
I'm just
go ahead.
curious, have you branched into sustainable agriculture? So like, for example, switching from monoculture traditional crops back to like perennial grains and using that as kind of, it's kind of a conduit or somewhere between restoration of native landscapes, but and sustainable use for, providing food resources.
Well, I haven't, mostly because we're USGS and we want to kind of stay in our lane with working with wild spaces, which can include ranch lands. But usually when we get into agriculture, that's more USDA territory. And, not to be divisive, but just to say they have a whole portfolio of experience they're just better to do that job. So hopefully that answers your question. But I do love all of these sort of new guidance for farmers coming out these days around soil health and for both farmers and ranchers. And, our RestoreNet sites are sort of second, we call it version 2.0, is really looking at soil health and soil microbial communities. And a lot of that was largely driven by our rancher partners who want to know more about that. They want to know how their soil shapes up in some of their degraded areas compared to reference sites. And they want to know how they can use cattle as a tool to accomplish some of their goals. And so we're including all of that in our sort of next version of RestoreNet.
All right. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, Molly, thank you so much for your presentation and your time today. And as we mentioned, we'll have it posted online and the recording up soon, hopefully. But appreciate everyone joining us today, and we'll look for you. I think the next coming up one will be our virtual workshop in October. So see you guys all then soon. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.